morning. Afternoon, yeah. So it's Sunday. Sunday is always the smallest by far of all the presentations. I really appreciate you guys coming in. By Sunday afternoon, most people are kind of tired. Maybe you're tired and you're just here because you can sit down for an hour. It's fine. And also, we had a lot of people come through the last couple of days. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time to come in and see what we have to talk about here in terms of defensive shooting skill development. The NRA annual convention, annual meetings and exhibits, the official name, is always a highlight for me of the year for a couple of different reasons. These presentations that they give me the opportunity to talk about a couple different concepts, this one and the home defense, are really the core of what we teach. It's the core of the information that we communicate through Personal Defense Network. It's the core of what we teach through ICE Training Company, and especially this presentation is the core of our flagship program, the Combat Focused Shooting Program. So being able to talk about that and educate people that maybe can't get to our classes, we know that the price to train, the ammunition, hundreds of dollars a day, plus many hundreds of rounds a day, all that adds up. You got to be away from your family, you got to take off work, you got to do those things. So the opportunity to talk to you for an hour or two about some of these concepts is really important for me, because this may be what motivates you to come out and take a class from one of these instructors that I'm going to introduce you to later, or any of the other instructors that are out there in the industry that may not be affiliated with us, but are teaching good, solid defensive shooting skills. And we actually just had a question from one of you that's in the audience about another school, another program that exists that teaches some things differently from what I teach. Any doctors in the audience today? Anybody ever been to a doctor in the audience today? We'll get some class participation. So think about, we had a doctor in this presentation on Friday, and I asked him, I said, well, how far back do you have to go to where there was one doctor in the village, so to speak? And he said, well, probably about 300 years ago. But that's when specialization started happening inside of the medical community, apparently. And I never asked that question before, but what I have talked about is this concept of specialization, that at some point in the distant past, several generations ago, there was one doctor. That doctor took care of broken arms, birth and babies, headaches, demonic possession, whatever else they were worried about 300, 400, 500 years ago. That one doctor took care of everything, probably took care of the animals too, right? So now today, we have different specialists for like left knees and right knees, right? There's too much information out there, and there's too much specialization. There's too much knowledge to fit into one human head, and there's too much going on in the medical community to help people be healthful and fit and live long, happy lives, or live as long as they can, be as happy as they can, be as fit as they can, for one person to teach everything and for one person to do everything. And shooting is like that. Shooting is a much younger area of research and a much younger area of science, but shooting also has specializations, right? You wouldn't expect the person that's teaching long-range precision rifle to necessarily be really good at teaching defensive pistol shooting. But even defensive pistol shooting is different from marksmanship or basic pistol use, and that's important to understand too. And that probably wasn't the case nearly as much 30 years ago. And in fact, if you look specifically at what now is the defensive firearms training industry, it was started by people who were competitive shooters. Now, they may have come from a military or law enforcement background, but their activity was competition. And they were designing programs that overlapped very closely with what we now know as USPSA or IPSC and eventually IDPA. That was based on the idea that the way we were training on the ranges was the way we were going to compete so that we got better at the defensive shooting. That was the idea. What has happened is there's been a lot of evolution over the last 30 to 40 years, in what we know about how fights actually happen, what we know about how the body and brain react and respond together when fights are happening. We know, obviously, the guns have evolved quite a bit over the last 30, 40 years. We have a whole new generation of modern striker-fired, polymer, reliable, mid-length pull, mid-weight type trigger guns. So there's a lot of things that are different. And if you're still teaching exactly the same thing that you were teaching 40 years ago, and you're still using the same techniques you were using 40 years ago, before we had dash camera videos, before we had good high-quality surveillance camera videos in every convenience store, every bank, every street corner practically in some cities, before we had all this information, high-level reality-based training with simunitions and role players and things like this, we know so much more today than we did 40 years ago about shooting, and defensive shooting in particular. If you're still teaching the same thing, you're just not teaching what people need, and that's the truth. What you're probably teaching is target shooting. How many of you are target shooters, gun enthusiasts, gun collectors? Okay. I'm a gun collector, I'm a gun enthusiast, I do target shooting, I do recreational shooting. How many of you primarily own guns for personal defense or defense of other people that you care about, defense of our way of life, ultimately? That's what the Second Amendment's about. It's not about competition shooting, it's not about hunting, it's not about sport shooting, it's not about the American tradition. It's about defense. It's about defense of our way of life, and that starts with defense of our life. So let me see that again. Hands in the air if the last gun you're going to give up is the gun that you would rely on for personal defense. Not the heirloom, not the hunting gun. Okay, cool. So keep your hands up for a second. How many of you that say that have more than 5 guns? We're at the NRA show, and you're still here on Sunday afternoon, so that's just about everybody, right? Okay, so you have more than 5 guns, and you primarily own guns for defense. Put your hands down if you have taken a defensive firearms class that was not required by the military, law enforcement, or to get a permit. Okay, everybody with your hand up in the air, sell a gun, go take a class. Sell a gun, And the only reason I say sell a gun and take a class is because if you haven't taken the time, effort, and energy to go get training, one of the reasons might be budget. But if you've got 10, 12, 15, 20 guns in your house, and you're saying you're primarily interested in personal defense or home defense, defense of others, defense of your way of life, you've got 20 guns and you've never taken a class, you're a gun collector. Nothing wrong with being a gun collector, but don't raise your hand and say you primarily own guns for personal defense. I think there's an integrity check that you should do. Training and practice are incredibly important. Can you watch videos at Personal Defense Network? Can you go read the books? Can you go do all that stuff and then go practice on your own and get good? Sure, it's possible. But you're going to dramatically increase your odds of getting really good if you get the right kind of training and you get the right kind of coaching and you get some supervised practice to develop those skills in the way that we're going to talk about today, or whichever way you choose to follow. There are a lot of good programs out there. The information you're going to see in this presentation is primarily drawn from the Combat Focus Shooting Program and the stuff that our defensive firearms coaches teach in our Intro to Home Defense Handgun and our Intro to Concealed Carry Handgun classes. So when it comes to practice, when it comes to skill development, when it comes to training, when you've taken the opportunity to go out and take that class,